As I've said before, you can take the man out of the army, but you can't take the army out of the man. So we have an ambitious schedule today. I want to keep the trains moving on time. Welcome, everybody. I'm Gary Korn, the Director of the Technology Law and Security Program. I want to welcome everyone here and online to, I think is a really very important discussion we're going to have today. And thank our partners in putting this together, the Institute of Security and Technology, Megan and Steve, conversing in the corner over there, and they'll be stepping up in front of the podium later on today. So I was at an event last night, and the launch of the Vanderbilt National Security Center, and I mentioned to a few people that we were holding this event today, and I'm going to be honest with you, one or two of them gave me kind of an eye roll. We've been talking about this for a long time, information sharing, improving the public-private partnering, et cetera, and that's true. But we've made great strides. I think there's certainly the time I was at U.S. Cyber Command, when I was the lawyer there, I saw a lot of increased collaboration and improvement there, both across the government and with the private sector. But I don't know that we're where we need to be to fully address the threat space that we're looking at. And that's what we're here to talk about. Because our time is limited, I'm going to give you one administrative note. You see microphones on the tables in front of you. They are active. The technology in this room does not allow us to disable them. And we've had this in the past a few times where the sidebar conversations in the back of the room are predominating over the actual speakers on the Zoom or in the recording. So be mindful. They're there for when we get into Q&A, but they are live. So anything you say can and will be used against you.
No cursing.
All right. No cursing. All right. With that, I'm just going to move to introduce our kickoff keynote speaker. Thank you very much, Chris Inglis. The most important aspect of Chris Inglis's biography is he's a return board member for the Tech Law and Security Program. I think that's what you highlight in your career. Is that
That's
not
true. That's right.
No.
Start with that, end with that.
And of course, the inaugural
And why would that
director.
remark about the microphones do I feel like I've been suddenly rocketed back to the national security and say, oh, was that my inner voice? So Gary's asked me to kind of talk about operational collaboration. What does that mean? What are the tenets of that? I will do that. I promise you I'm not going to give you the weave, whatever that is. But I'm going to wander a bit. I'm going to start in a place that might be a little bit different, and then get to main point by describing what I think is required for us to have the confidence in digital infrastructure that we need to have going forward. My background, by way of introduction, spent a long time at the National Security Agency, kind of was an Air Force pilot for a while. I was happy once. Having left NSA, I did some work in the private sectors on a couple of boards, FedEx, an IT company that happens to have airplanes. Kind of was on the Solarium Commission that recommended we have a U.S. National Cyber Director, having helped throw that past, didn't realize I'd be the only one in the field to catch it. I was the National Cyber Director for 2 years. We delivered a strategy that talks a lot about operational collaboration based upon the insights that the Solarium Commission delivered. So I will speak from that lens, from that experience. Let me start with an anecdote. I've used this in venues like this before. If you've heard it before, you can break eye contact. I'll move quickly. But the anecdote essentially borrows from an alleged encounter between Prime Minister John Major and Boris Yeltsin at the moment that Boris Yeltsin was attempting to take the Soviet Union and motor it across this open clearing to become a free and open democracy known as Mother Russia. Of course, it didn't work so well. But John Major was querying Boris Yeltsin in a conversation one day. It's like, how's it going? I mean, what are your indices of success? What sorts of things are going on? What lines of effort? And Boris was very affronted by the temerity of anyone asking him a question. I mean, for Christ's sake, he's the premier of the Soviet Union, not yet Russia. And so he was kind of pushing back on all that. John Majors thought the better of it, says maybe we start slow on this, and says, well, in a word, Boris, how's it going? And Boris said, in a word, good, right? But John Majors, seeing an opening, said, how's it going in 2 words? He said, 2 words, not good. Right? Now, I tell that story because much of our lives, present and future, are defined by those 2 tracks. There's every reason to believe that what we're about to encounter, what we're about to do, whether it's the election in 2 weeks' time, or our reliance on digital infrastructure, that there's something good to be seen in that, some silver lining inside of that. Or on the other hand, maybe 50% of the nation thinks there's something not so good about that. Both of those futures lie before us. Many people would say that the difference between those two futures is fate. I think that's nonsense. I think the difference is choice. That is particularly true with respect to digital infrastructure. We can choose to make the necessary investments, and I'm going to argue not just technology investments, but investments in who's accountable for what, doctrinal investments. We can make investments in skills, we can make investments in education, so that our future by with and through cyberspace is a very positive one. And there's every reason to believe that that is possible. You take a look at what we did in the COVID crisis. We diagnosed, devised a patch, deployed that patch, otherwise known as a vaccine, in record time. Somewhere between 6 to 12 months, the vaccine was ready. Another 6 months of extraordinary logistics, and that thing was deployed worldwide, saved millions of lives. Now, there was some perhaps dawdling in the front end of that made it such that we lost some time. But the internet was there for us. Cyberspace was there for us. And the ability to analyze at speed, to essentially collaborate at speed, and to deploy at speed was something that says we have a very good future. And with quantum computing just around the corner and all manner of other transformative technologies, I think we can, by choice, have a great future. Of course, it's impossible to pick up the paper on any given day and not see that there's a bad future coming our way, a not good future coming our way. CrowdStrike is the most recent example of a relatively simple, strategically simple failure that brought everything to a stop. CrowdStrike, married with Microsoft, about a month and a half ago, was what we thought Y2K was going to be. If you don't know what Y2K is, come see me afterwards. I'll explain that. Some in the room probably were born after that, but I can still remember waiting up all day to see if Y2K was going to bring the world to a stop. It did not. But we've not actually kind of whistled our way past that graveyard. There are still singular vulnerabilities in this space that either nature or incompetence and sometimes an active adversary can take advantage of. But there is a not good future out there if we choose, or if there are complacency, we don't choose the good future, right? And so let me then talk my way through that. Digital infrastructure is not a system unto itself. It's not a system that lives in the corner or is siloed in some way that we can actually kind of say, we'll get that right, and then we'll attend to all the other things that we do in our personal lives, our business lives, our national security lives. Have you heard anything I've said? Oh, good. It was a great joke, by the way. Digital infrastructure is, against what you might be observing, is not something that's a silo in the corner. It's not something independent of other systems of interest. A good friend of mine, Jeff Moss, who's renowned for Black Hat and DEF CON, he's the kind of creator of that. He starts his cyber talks with a question. He generally starts by saying, does anyone in the room know why race cars have bigger brakes? Everyone who thought they were showing up for cyber talk immediately breaks eye contact, looks to the door saying, can they sneak their way through that in the next 2 minutes? And he immediately rejoinders. He goes, race cars have bigger brakes so they can go faster. We should think of cyberspace the same way. Why do we care about cyberspace? Why do we care about digital infrastructure? Not for its own sake. We care about it for the things that we already care about. We care about it because we want to bank online. We care about it because we want to reach markets kind of in a given day that we can't physically get to in the given day. We care about it because we want to follow our friends or my grandchildren kind of online using social media. We care about it for all the reasons that make life matter, that make life special, that make life worth living. We shouldn't elevate cyber's priority. We should subordinate it. We should consider that it's kind of integral to the lives that we lead, the businesses that we run, the national security that we seek. Two, cyber is not independent of all those other systems. Tends to be that those systems increasingly have a lot in common, but they're also connected. And let me start with the first point first. The systems that we rely upon to live our lives, climate, economies, finances, telecommunications, politics, domestic and international geopolitics, and digital infrastructure increasingly share kind of a particular trait, which is they lack the inherent resilience to meet the expectations we might have that they'll be there for us, that they'll do what we want them to do. Very small kind of perturbation in the climate somewhere is going to lead to the next hurricane, which will be yet another 100-year hurricane inside of 3 months, having had the last one. Right? We have found that the inherent resilience, inertia, robustness of the climate has been leached away. Same thing's true in the financial system. Silicon Valley Bank failed, dramatically failed about 1.5 years ago when we thought we had fixed that once and for all in 2008, 2009. kind of politics where we thought we had actually whistled past that graveyard, that this nation, kind of with a free and open kind of election based upon a free and open architecture and a free and open society, was more unified than it was perhaps divided. And maybe that's not the case. It's incredibly fragile at the moment, and you have only to look at the press to see what we're talking about in the next 2 weeks to believe that there's some degree of fragility in that. Geopolitics, international politics. We thought we were actually past the point where great nations or nations with great power would use physical force to compel or to bring to heal another nation that wasn't doing what they thought they should do. And yet you have Russia attacking the Ukraine. Why? Because the Ukraine wanted to align with the West. You have Iran through its proxies attacking Israel through Hamas and Hezbollah because Israel had the audacity to essentially try to find a place in the Middle East, or more particularly, was trying to reconcile to various nations in the Middle East. Now, that's a particular point of view that I have. You may or may not share that, but you have to agree that it's fragile. It's incredibly fragile. Let me come back to cyberspace. It's incredibly fragile in a way that we should not be surprised because we never made the investments necessary to make it anything more than fragile. For the last 50 years, we have ruthlessly invested in innovation and market efficiency. One product, one transformative generation of products after another, but have never really given the time and attention to inherent resilience and robustness such that we could have a reasonable expectation that it would do for us what we want it to do under the conditions you can reasonably foresee. I use reasonable a lot. I'm not sure it's a legal term, but in the world I come from, people should behave reasonably. Systems should behave reasonably. You should have some expectation how these things would perform. And that can only be based upon what investments you know have been made or investments that you care to make. We need to put the third leg under the stool, which is inherent resilience and robustness. So I'm going to follow that theme and perhaps double down on technology, but I will say that those systems that I just described, they're all inherently connected to one another. Cyber is an instrument of power used in all of those other systems. It's an instrument of power that can stabilize them, can help them deliver kind of what you want from them, or destabilize them and make it such that others accrue the value from them. Cyber is the underpinning, it's the underlayment of all of those. But let's talk about cyber for a minute. The system of interest we know as cyberspace is not a mass of technology. It is not, when you close your eyes and trying to think about what cyberspace is, kind of computers with blinking front screens, red and green lights. Lord knows why they do that. It's not a mass of wires. It's not satellites. It's not cables. It's not all that stuff that are the tangible, objective, observable pieces that constitute cyberspace. To be sure, technology and a range of technologies are in cyberspace, and they might be the means to deliver cyberspace, but that's not the whole of cyberspace. Cyberspace is comprised of at least three kind of distinct entities. One is technology. The second is people. People are not merely afflicted by it or served by it or adjacent to it. They're in it. The choices that people make implicate cyber futures. Most of the mistakes that are made that transgressors take advantage of are made by people. People not using technology in ways that they've been designed to be used. Clicking on a phishing link that they should not have clicked on, or perhaps falling prey to a social attack, a social kind of constructed attack that they should have known perhaps was something out of band and different than the accountability procedures inside their company. So people are the second part. But doctrine, fancy word for the assignment of roles, responsibilities, expectations, that's also in cyberspace. It's a part of cyberspace. Because if you don't get the doctrine right, if you don't get the assignment of roles, responsibilities, or expectations to precede those, you have no reason to believe that cyberspace will have that good future that I described earlier. Let me give two very specific examples of those latter two. You might all remember the SolarWinds moment was about 3 years ago now, possibly a little bit more, when the Russian government got into the software development environment of SolarWinds, essentially kind of having gotten in the front door, rode down the supply chain all the way to the end users, and essentially then played a surveillance game, kind of a computer network exploitation game, where they were simply looking for secrets worth having and shipping those back to Moscow. Now, they were discovered by Mandiant because of a loose thread at some point in time, but I'll never forget what the CEO of SolarWinds said, something along these lines when he was testifying before Congress. And if you haven't done that, it's a visit to Mordor. It's not to be missed. It's really exciting. But he's testifying before Congress, and he said something to the effect of, in the future, SolarWinds would like to be known as a security company. At which point, everybody's looking over their shoulder and saying, "What were you before?" right? Were you just an accounting company that would help you account for the devices in your network and whether they're properly patched, what their current disposition is? My view is that that actually was indicative of a doctrinal failure. SolarWinds did not see themselves as a security company, or they didn't actually see themselves as guaranteeing security through their software development environment, down the supply chain into the end customers. The end customers probably assumed, not without justification, that SolarWinds had delivered a secure product that was well defended. The vendors in that middle of that supply chain assumed that what came from the factory was easily sustained by simply not kind of disrupting, right, the content of what was in the box or what was in the package. And therefore, everybody assumed that somebody else had taken care of security. The Russians, seeing that open front door, didn't have to use a vaunted zero-day vulnerability to get into the system. They just walked right through the front door. That's a doctrinal failure. That's a fundamental doctrinal failure. In Colonial Pipeline, that's of course a people failure. Remember, I think that was akin to a phishing attack where a Russian criminal gang got into the administrative side of Colonial Pipeline. And when the kind of the first responders showed up, somewhere between the FBI and some commercial companies, they asked a very reasonable question right up front of the people who are managing the administrative side of Colonial Pipeline. I said, is your IT side, your administrative side, connected to your OT side? Where the pipes, the motors, the valves, where the petroleum lives? They gave the worst possible answer, which was, I don't know, right? At which point the only advice that the first responders could give was, well, shut it down, because something far worse is about to happen because you don't know your network. It wasn't just a human mistake of clicking the link, but a human failure not knowing the architecture that you had built and deployed and were responsible to defend. That's a human error, right? And we cannot then blame that on technology. I mentioned those three entities, technology and skills, people, right, and doctrine, in the wrong order because they're important in the reverse order. We've got to get the doctrine right. We've got to get the people skills right. We've got to get the technology right. Now, let me double down on technology. We often think that technology can be the salvation of us. Technology can save us. Technology is the end game. To be sure, technology can be innovative and creative, and there are excellent technologies out there that can be extraordinarily helpful, but they must be delivered in context. They must be delivered in the context of who's responsible for what and what's the expectation of a skill issue or an education issue here. But let me give you two reasons to perhaps doubt that technology can in and of itself be the answer. I wasn't there, but I've read my history about the 1930s when faced in a flat world with the existence of internal combustion machines, aircraft, all manner of motorized vehicles that had tank treads that could go great distances over rough terrain. The Germans came up with this idea called blitzkrieg. It was remarkable, and it shocked, stunned, and amazed the world, kind of in the 1940 timeframe when they launched that, having practiced it in the Spanish Civil War when they launched that and defeated physically and numerically, and I think technologically superior armies in the form of the French and the Brits. And it wasn't that the Germans had better technology. Maybe the Stuka dive bomber was better technology, but the Tiger tank hadn't yet been invented. It was the doctrine. Because the French in that flat world, when they saw the very same technologies, they decided they were going to build the Maginot Line, right? There were two very different kind of approximations about how you combine this technology to come up with something that serves your society. That was a doctrinal kind of, I think, success on the part of the Germans and a doctrinal failure on the part of the French. Let's fast forward to the present day. Some of you may be familiar with something called AUKUS. We're trying to transfer advanced technologies from the United Kingdom and the United States to Australia, and not just technologies like the nuclear technology, which is at the center of that proposition, but cyber technologies as well. And as a byproduct of that, trying to transfer those technologies, we're studying what the loyal opposition might be doing, say the Chinese. There's an institute called the Australian Strategy Institute, or Strategy Policy Institute, ASPI, and they have studied 44 different technology groups of concern to modern nations, to dominant nations. Technology groups like material science, high-performance computing, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And they have determined that in those 44 technology groups, there is a nation on the planet that is in first place in terms of innovation. Now, how did they decide that? They looked at peer-reviewed papers that were sourced not just to their citizens, but also sourced to citizens who were working in the employ of institutions or the government in a particular country. And I'd ask for a show of hands, how many people think that in first place, 37 out of 44 times is the United States? No, it's China. China's in first place in 37 of 44. The United States is in first place in the remaining 7, to include artificial intelligence. When China's in first place, they're in first place by 20, 25 percentage points in terms of peer-reviewed, innovative, creative papers. When the United States is in first place, they're in first place by 1 or 2 percentage points. Why? Because China has made it their business to select and to be good, to be kind of deep and sharp, good, excellent at certain technology groups. You might then think, well, that's it, game over. But when you stand back and look at this study, there are a couple of things that are somewhat interesting. One is the study is actually taking care to figure out who are the first 5 in every one of those 44 technology groups. And so India shows up on occasion, the Netherlands, because of their fabrication of advanced processors, they show up on occasion, the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. But you know who never shows up in 44 times 5 kind of awards? 44 groups, 5 kind of first through 5th place. Who never shows up? Israel. Israel never shows up. Israel is 0.12% of the world's population, just under, I think, 10 million people, out of a population, global population of about 8 billion or so. So that's about 0.0012, if I've got my math right. So about 0.12% of the world's population. And yet, in the discipline that is going to be at the core of much of what we talk about over the next 4 or 5 hours, cyber or digital infrastructure, Israel, with 0.12% of the world's population, is 20% of the market play in terms of cyber defense and cyber offense. How can that be when they don't even show up, right, in the list of winners in terms of who's got the creative innovation? Because the technology in a flat world is less important than the use of that technology, right? How do you pick it up and employ that? And Israel, known as the innovation nation, is excellent at taking these discoveries that might exist a world away and trying to figure out how do they rapidly employ and deploy them across a society where the government, the private sector actually have this sense of common cause, common aspiration, very tight weave of their kind of sense of economic vitality, national security, and so on and so forth. We can argue about what they've done kind of in the Gaza Strip or what's happening kind of up north in Hezbollah. That's not my point. My point is that there's an example where they've made extraordinary use of technology that they didn't create. That's a doctrinal success, as much or more as it's a technology success. Kind of coming to main point, though, what then kind of should we think of going forward in terms of how do we achieve the confidence in digital infrastructure that we would like to achieve? First point is we have to think about it as more than technology. We have to think about it as doctrine and skills and technology, and we have to think about it in that order. 2, we have to understand that the institutions that win, the organizations that win, are ones that make innovative and creative use of all 3 of those entities, and typically do so in a coalition. Best example I can think of is what the Ukrainians have done. On the eve of the Ukrainian crisis, I and others who were in the White House, and there are a couple here who were in the White House at the time, were asked by a variety of people, like, how's this going to go, right? And I think objective analysis, and mine included, was that Ukrainians are fighting for their existence as a nation state, so they'll give a good account of themselves. But they're numerically outnumbered by a heavy margin, and technologically outnumbered by the kind of technology that Russia can bring to bear and the depth of the bench that Russia has. And so it's very likely, this was an assessment in February 2022, it's very likely that not just on the physical battlefield, but on the digital battlefield, the cyber battlefield, that they go down in 2-3 weeks, maybe a couple of months, that they just cannot kind of withstand the overmatch that Russia is going to bring to bear. And yet here they are, kind of almost 2 years later, still standing tall on both feet. And in the cyber domain, I think being entirely more successful than what we've observed on the physical battlefield, but successful to be sure on both of those. And what's the secret there? Well, I'm going to go in the wrong order. They made enough investments in the technology to make it defensible. They built in what we would describe as fire breaks and kind of alternate sources of analytic horsepower, cloud kind of solutions. If an on-prem data center gets blown up, they can back into the cloud, and so on and so forth. They invested enough that the technology was defensible, but it's by no means it's not the technology you want to go to war with. It's what I would describe as a dog's breakfast. Yesterday's bagel, today's eggs, down payment on tomorrow's yogurt. It's not the kind of thing that you want to build and deploy with high confidence. It alone is going to meet your needs. 2, they realize that expertise matters in this world, and they double down on that. They have world-class expertise. Remember the Colonial Pipeline debacle, where kind of the folks said, I really don't know how my own architecture is arrayed, how it actually works. They've not made that mistake. The bet that the Ukrainians have is that when you get into my architecture, and you will, as a transgressor, get into my architecture, I will know my architecture better than you do. I can outmaneuver. I'm more agile. I will dominate you in that space. Think about what the Chinese government has said as a matter of doctrine is their technique going forward, that if they're in a head-to-head contest with a cyber adversary, that's not inevitable, to be clear, but if they're in a head-to-head contest, they live off the land. What does that mean? The premise is they're going to move into your network and they're going to use the tools that they find there. And their bet is that they can actually outmaneuver and be more agile than you on your territory using your tools. The Ukrainians take that away. They said, no, can't do that to us. We are going to be world-class. You cannot beat us on our own territory. And three, the Ukrainians, which I think is the point of this talk and the point of this conference, three, the Ukrainians have built this coalition such the Russians have to beat many parties in order to beat the one party that they're after. They have to beat Microsoft and ESET and Elon Musk when he'll loan his Starlink terminals in for the day. I'm just kidding on that one. But they have to beat all of that in order to beat the one thing that they want to beat, which is the Ukrainians. That's a war-winning proposition. And the Ukrainians have got that in the proper order. They built that doctrine. They doubled down on their expertise, and they built the technology that was sufficient, not perfect, but not believing that the technology in and of itself could be the end game on this. So what's the lessons for all of us going forward? There's nothing particularly unique about our situation in cyberspace, except for the intensity of what we face. But we are under assault all day, every day. We're being crowdsourced by criminals, by complacency, and by kind of active, kind of hostile nation states, being crowdsourced every day. And have we, in fact, got this premise where we're going to actually make them beat all of us to beat one of us, where we're going to actually define a coalition where in the setup of how you build these architectures, how you deploy these architectures, how you sustain these architectures, how you detect something going wrong in these architectures, the life force coursing through these architectures, and the response to that, have we got it such that the coalition is actually solid all the way through that? Two, have we got world-class expertise essentially deployed across those architectures that they have to actually understand that our architecture better than we understand our architecture? We cannot, should not give that away. And three, have we made the necessary investments in technology, which is required? Have we made the necessary investments in technology to prevail in this regard? What I've observed, and I think many of us could say the same, is that the companies that do well are not the companies that avoid entirely cyber kind of pratfalls, whether it's a breach or something else. It's almost impossible in this day and age. I would say that we shouldn't seek mediocrity, but we should understand you're going to get into some difficult circumstances. The companies that prosper, thrive and prosper in that are the companies that have actually built a defensible architecture, deployed expertise, and are part of a coalition such that when that occurs, they can actually not simply surge to emergency status, which is the control of your own assets, maybe working 24/7 with the things you own, but they actually can deploy a coalition, which is into the crises, which is an augmentation of your assets that you prearranged in terms of the relationships and the muscle memory before the event. I'll leave you with two anecdotes to perhaps kind of backstop that. I was at a kind of a major cyber threat operations center in New York City last week. I'll leave the name of the bank out of it, but this bank does a huge amount of business, right? Kind of broadly moving money to kind of reconcile payments and to balance accounts at the end of a market trading day. And they're on Wall Street because proximity matters, because the speed matters. And so it's a very critical asset. And they said that they had observed within the last week another major bank, and both of these are tier 3 banks, another major bank who had offered a credit card that had a $50 kind of upfront, we'll give you $50 for free. Come on in. Once you're kind of established, we'll see how you use that $50. And then we'll perhaps kind of establish a credit rating for you. We'll open the portfolio a little bit. We'll actually be a little bit more generous, but we'll do it for $50. What the first bank saw in the second bank, because they were actually reconciling the payments, the flow of money to these credit cards, was that 15,000 of them had been opened on the second day. 15,000 of them had been opened on the second day. And therefore 15,000 times $50 had flowed into this. It was a spike across above a baseline that no one else could have seen, except for the fact that somebody's actually watching the network. And it wasn't the owner, right, of the asset or the person that was going to be harmed if that asset was abused. It was somebody that was in a position to see what was happening in the larger ecosystem. They picked up the phone, called the second bank and said, do you know that this is happening? And so, well, we were going to check this kind of in the first week or the second week, but by that time, 15,000 probably would have 150,000. What happened? What happened was that this syndicate of folks I don't know whether it's in WhatsApp or the dark app or the dark web or some other such kind of vehicle, but somebody had found the weakness and said, oh my God, this is an open door. It's a tiny little open door. But at scale, we can all take advantage of this and we can mobilize this. Think what generative AI could do to take advantage of this. We can mobilize this at speed, and we can actually then beat the audit system that actually is operating at human speed on the part of that second bank. The first bank was in a place to see that because they'd actually instrumented that space. And they said, we're going to actually make it our business to know what's actually happening in real time in that space. It could warn the second. None of that was a technology flaw. It was a doctrinal flaw, right? It was like, we just take this little risk. And if it's abused at scale, it'll be maybe a medium or high consequence, but it's a little risk. And therefore they focused on the little risk, not the consequence that if this thing is at scale used, what does that mean? It's a doctrinal failure or failure of imagination to think through the doctrinal applications of that. That's increasingly the nature of the world we live in, where we can't simply say, I'm going to look through the technology lens and make sure I remove all of the weaknesses, all the frailties in that technology. To be sure, that's important. But making it defensible doesn't make it well defended. That's a human activity. And not defending it as a coalition makes it such that we kind of are going to fail to actually make an adversary in this space beat all of us to beat one of us. Now, I'm sure the conference will get to two topics, and I'll cover them very quickly, and I'll then close with perhaps kind of my admonition. One will be, okay, got it. If we want then a robust collaboration between all parties in this space, does that mean that we want a collaboration as opposed to a division effort between the private sector and the public sector? Yes, exclamation point. Capital Y, capital E, capital S, yes, exclamation point. But not confusing, whether one is allowed to exercise the authorities of the other or vice versa. I don't think we want to give letters of marque to the private sector so that they can step out and begin to do offensive operations outside of owned or consented territory, imposing kind of offensive, either punitive or kind of follow-up measures on something outside. Why? Because they don't have the powers of discrimination that governments are charged to have. They're not authorized to actually understand what's happening on the battlefield over the far horizon. Intelligence organizations or kind of attachés or other nations engaged in diplomacy, they're authorized to know that. But private entities are not authorized to do that kind of work such that they have the powers of discrimination, know what they would shoot at in the first place. Two, they don't have the full power of a government such that if they're beginning to fire cyber bullets legitimately in defense of themselves outside of their owned or consented territory, they might find that the thing that's firing back is not just using cyber bullets, but maybe deploying an army or diplomats in the United Nations or panoply of other instruments of power that are unique and special to kind of the governments of the world. And so I think we should be careful about confusing the role of the private sector and the public sector, but they must be complementary. They must be complementary in the setup, in the deployment, in the sustainment, and the defense. And the only way government can expect that the private sector is going to fulfill that role, right, in all of those phases, is that the government needs to fully and aggressively fulfill its role. If the government fails to stand in front of the private sector or to enable the private sector or to share with the private sector what it knows about unique information in that space, that it should not expect that the private sector will respond in any other way other than to say, let's play go fish. You got cards, I got cards, ask me a question. If you ask the wrong question, you don't get an answer, right? We need to put our cards on the table and play one game, one scoreboard in the room across all the phases of that space. I probably run slightly long. I would just close with this and say, I think that we've got an extraordinarily good future. I think that that is a choice we can make. I think it's a choice we made in things like the national strategy of 2023, but we have failed to exercise kind of the muscles necessary to actually effect or to realize that future, right? We have inspirationally, kind of in an inspired way, talked about collaboration, and yet many occasions we're still doing division of effort. We need to take those silos down and understand how do we actually achieve that with the necessary kind of example, right, that the Ukrainians have offered us, or the Israelis have offered us in both of those kind of phases of that life cycle, and say that we can do together something that none of us can do alone with any amount of money or resources. Don't know whether you want me to take any questions. I'm happy to take question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis, for joining us and great comments. Sort of following up on that, I'm Sean from Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit, spent time with the FBI. And so I've lived on both sides of this, and this whole concept of from the National Cybersecurity Strategy of 2023 to come together, pillar 2, dismantle cyber threat actors. I think generally we know it's not a call to action for the letters of marque. or for, folks in the private sector to get raid jackets and go kicking doors. But what is the vision there? There's a call for folks to come together, public, private sector, form these tactical cells. What does that look like? What was the vision? And how do we effectuate that? We're going to peel the onion back on that sort of concept today during the course of the conference on what are remaining sort of legal or policy barriers to that. But like, what does that look like if it's not the letters of marque, if it's not the just giving governmental powers to private sector?
Yeah, so I mentioned the life phases for a reason. That's a great question for a reason. Now we're all inspired, informed, hobbled, kind of condemned by the experience, the lives that we've led. I spent an appreciable amount of my time in the U.S. intelligence community. We have something called the Five Eyes relationship. It's not the only relationship that matter or relationships that matter, but it's a remarkable one that actually practices what I would call the truest form of collaboration. And what's that look like? What they do is they share without precondition, consistent with the laws that govern those 5 different nations. And what then ensues is that the National Security Agency, for example, kind of dealing with GCHQ, would say, look, you have the authority to look at all the stuff I collect. I have no idea what is of particular interest to you, but you have the authority to look at it once I've minimized it. I'm not going to let you look at U.S. person information, but you have the authority to look at that. And what then happens, and it was recorded for the first time in a book in 1940, something called Men of Secrets, if you wanted to go look at this. What then happens, what the Brits say is, you gave us things we would not have known you had, nor would you have known were valuable to us. That's the true nature of the setup in that collaboration, which is we can discover things together that no one of us would actually have had the propensity to understand. Even if we could query the databases at a distance, we never would have been able to do that. I think that that's the setup on this, which is how do we actually say, this is something that's a common affliction, or this is something that I can see part of, but it's afflicting you. And I never would have actually come to that conclusion if I just based upon what I know in my stovepipe. So I'm going to wait until I cross the threshold. Wait till I cross some threshold before I say, now I have something I want to give to you. And then I push it across to the top and all the way down the bottom. So we need to collaborate the lowest possible level, not the highest possible level. 2, kind of, as I'd indicated in that example that I showed about the banks, it's less about kind of some actor who's essentially active kind of in this space, or about some technology attack surface that might be vulnerable and you might enjoy that, than it is about actually the video that connects the two. How do we actually understand the life forces in something approaching real time? The JCDC has attempted to do that at the Department of Homeland Security, less successfully than I think most people would want. Microsoft in particular, I think, finds it difficult to show up there because just like we know more than you can tell us.
No comment.
I'm being honest here. But that being said, the authority has been vested in the JCDC to represent the government's larger efforts. What should happen in my view? We should take what the NSA is doing at the Cyber Collaboration Center, which actually has the benefit of this global intelligence system, the SIGINT system. We should take that and we should make it such that that information is available not just to the defense industrial base, but by, with, and through a presence on the JCDC floor, it's also available to customers who show up there, or partners who show up there, collaborators who show up there. And similarly with the FBI, right? Well, what the FBI knows based upon its domestic investigations and its legats that operate around the world, how do we deploy that, right, through that JCDC floor? Achieving at once coherence and a comprehensive treatment of all the things that the government knows, and being very proactive about pushing that so that we can see things together that no one of us could see alone. And then in the disruption, how do we then say, either explicitly or implicitly, I'll start with implicitly, like, we now know this is a common affliction. Everybody in the room knows what to do. Use your various authorities to go do something about this. If it's inside your system, rip and replace. If it's an authority that you have to go shut that down because you're the FBI, by all means, go do that. If it's something happening in another country and the State Department's present here, then by all means, kind of make that request. But that's implicit collaboration. We're now observing and orienting to this common affliction and having the common aspiration. We want this thing to work for us. We want a good future, right? All sorts of concurrent activity can be implicitly collaborative going forward. You can be then explicit about that. The NCIJTF, by kind of White House policy some number of years ago, was essentially responsible under the FBI's leadership to do threat response. I still think that's a good idea. Somebody should be the center of what do we do about threat response? How can we be explicit about saying we've got this ransomware actor or a major ransomware campaign? How can we take that down? That shouldn't be ceded to a tactical actor moment by moment that comes and goes based upon the intensity of the moment, but something we wake up every morning and say, can we, should we bring some assets to bear to disrupt this? Dmitry Perovich, I think probably well known to many in this group, speaks fondly, almost kind of tears in his eyes about a moment probably 6, 7 years ago, where the FBI, I think it was then CrowdStrike, a couple of other entities decided with malice aforethought, and I mean that with affection, malice aforethought, we're going to take down this ransomware actor, and they did, right? And it was extraordinary. And Dmitry keeps banging the pulpit. I'm with him. We got to do that again and again and again. But there's a life phase associated with that in terms of the setup, in terms of kind of the collaboration that kind of is teed up by virtue of how we have these relationships, and by the intentionality of how do we actually put these resources together to do what we can do together. Again, not abusing anyone's authorities, not misusing those authorities, not having any ambiguity about what's the role of the government, what's the role of the private sector. But if it's not all shoulders to the wheel, then something's missing. There's a weak link, and the adversaries who crowdsource us routinely will take advantage of it. Is that the question you asked?
No, great answer. I would just add on very briefly is that I think that strategic alignment on the targets to focus on is still something that we suffer from. So like getting over the hurdles of like that broader information sharing environment, like I want to get there, agree with that. I think for now, there are both the tactical and strategic alignment on what are the worst things? How do we collaborate in the environment we operate in currently? Let's focus on that. There's still gaps. And so that's
I agree. I do agree. I do agree. And so we're looking for a transformation, I think. Transformation's built on the back of real work. So let's pick some real problems. Let's actually get at it. Let's start to solve those real problems. I've mentioned one more thing, I'm probably out of time. One more thing, which is that this has to be an international effort. It can't be a national effort, right? The cyberspace does not respect those national boundaries. And I just share with you kind of an embarrassing insight that I got when I was at the White House, that I hadn't thought my way through this until somebody picked up the phone and called me and said, did you know? But when the White House was trying to put together the first ransomware task group, we actually mentioned by name parties like, you know, kind of Russia or their near abroad, or the North Koreans, the Iranians, or even Chinese, right? Like, if you want to kind of, as an international community, essentially push back on the efforts that are mounted by those parties, then join us. And Singapore called us one day and said, you know, it's almost impossible for us to come to this party because you've actually made it a geopolitical thing. If you were to rewrite this and to say, instead of kind of join a geopolitical coalition to essentially choose the side and be on the right side of history, if you were to say, why don't you come to the White House and focus on the needs of your citizens who are commonly afflicted by ransomware, regardless of its source, then Singapore will come. Turns out that we did that. Ann Neuberger rewrote that. We did that, and Singapore came, and Switzerland came, and India came, and all God's creatures came, because we'd actually had the right focus in terms of what our aspirations are. And so we need to remember that if this is not to be a national effort, but rather an international effort, how do we make it such that the goal, the ask, is inspiring, as opposed to something where you're asking somebody to do a favor for you, right? Does that make sense? Good. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Good luck.